And thank you to everyone here. Really appreciate you joining me here this morning. And then 2 additional thank yous. One, for listening in English for the next 40 minutes or so. I appreciate all of you, as I said, taking the time and being willing to listen to a talk that is not in Spanish. And then finally, thank you for allowing an American to be here on stage. We are not everyone's favorite people at the moment. So we feel very fortunate to be here and appreciate all of your generosity. So we're going to be talking about Mexico's e-commerce market on the global stage. And we're going to be taking a data-driven look at how e-commerce in Mexico has evolved and where the opportunities here lie. So a little bit on my background. I've been looking at different global e-commerce markets for over 15 years at this point. I was an analyst at Forrester for a number of years. Then I left to start an event in the US called Shop Talk, which we then expanded internationally, co-founded kind of a sister event called Grocery Shop. And then in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, I joined eMarketer as their chief content officer. And one of the things that I have been working to do there is to expand not only the coverage of e-commerce, but also expand our international coverage at the company. So what I'll be doing today is talking about some of the findings that we have about how Mexico has evolved, and then kind of how it stacks up against other global markets. And for those of you who aren't familiar with eMarketer, if you've ever seen these red and black charts that make the rounds on LinkedIn and in presentations, this is us. We focus on the transformation of digital markets, in particular digital advertising and e-commerce. And I should say you're all welcome to take pictures throughout the presentation, but there will be a QR code at the very end that will take you to a download page for the presentation if you want to get these slides. All right, so let's dive in. We're going to turn back the clock 10 years to kick us off. So if you remember where we were in 2015, that was the year when athleisure started moving out of fitness clubs and yoga studios into the mainstream. We were all talking about this dress and what color it was. The man bun was popular. And Alejandro Iñárritu won the Oscar for Birdman. Now, what was happening in e-commerce that year? Well, here in Mexico, delivery timeframes were still quite long, particularly in some of the smaller towns that could take upwards of a week to deliver packages, sometimes even 2. And that was not unique to Mexico. That was happening across the region. Cash on delivery was still very popular as a payment type. People would greet delivery folks at the door with cash to pay for their packages. Because there is a large unbanked population, many folks without credit cards, so this was far more popular than it is today. Facebook was emerging as a key marketing channel. It was shifting from being a place that you would go to exclusively to talk to friends and family or to interact with them, and became a key place where marketers were spending their ad budgets. And it was the year that Amazon launched in Mexico with a full product suite. They had been here before with very limited offerings, but it was 2015 when they came in really strongly with a variety of different product categories. So now I'm going to fast forward and go to the year 2025. And I want to talk about what the evolution of e-commerce has looked like here over the course of 10 years. So starting in 2015, this is where we were with Mexico. This is showing e-commerce penetration of retail. So in other words, out of every 100 pesos, 2 were being spent online in 2015. And you can see how it compares to other markets like the US, which was well above it, Germany and many of the Western European countries also above. Even Brazil was that step higher. Market like India was kind of in that same range, slightly below, but still an early stage market. So we're going to go fast forward 5 years here. And you can see Mexico's e-commerce market start to surge. So at this point, the e-commerce penetration of retail, the percentage of digital sales, had surpassed Brazil. So it was now a leader in the region because, of course, it's one of the two big economies in Latin America. But what's fascinating is if you look at what happens in the next 5 years, Mexico has been on this incredible trajectory, which is unlike anything we've seen in most parts of the world. It went up and up and up. It surpassed Germany. It surpassed most Western European markets, with the exception of the UK, which is very much of an anomaly. But the penetration is now very similar to what we see in the US. So it's been this huge success story where it went from having that incredibly low penetration to what is considered very high right now. So a shout out to all of you that played a role in helping drive up these numbers. But this is one of the reasons why I love looking at Mexico as an example. You can shoot forward over the course of a relatively limited time frame if you have players being very aggressive about rolling out digital offerings. Now, to put it in context, not of just e-commerce, but also the digital share of advertising. As I mentioned, eMarketer kind of looks at two big markets, with advertising being the other one. If you look at the region, it's kind of in three buckets. So you have these digitally nascent countries that are very early stage with both e-commerce and digital advertising. And again, we're looking at the share of the total markets here. Next category is what we call digitally emerging. And you can see Brazil is the big blue circle here because the size of the bubbles is the size of the overall economy. And then again, you've got Mexico, out above any of these other countries across the region, including Chile. I get asked about Chile a fair amount because they are digitally advanced, but Mexico has reached that next step up. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is advertising has not shifted as much as it has elsewhere. You can see it's just over 60% of all ad spend in Mexico that goes to digital. In a market like the US, it's about 80%. So we're going to talk about this later, but there is still a very strong reliance on some analog channels, in particular TV, in this market that we've kind of shifted away from heavily within the US. So going forward, what is growth going to look like here? Well, it's going to look a little different than it has in the past. If you saw the year 2013 sort of through 2019, it was kind of a bumpy set of growth rates, but quite high. Digital was always growing faster than physical channels were. Then we saw this huge spike during the pandemic, as we did everywhere. Now you've got much lower growth for e-commerce. Still high, a CAGR, a compound annual growth rate of over 10% is certainly good. It's just not the pace at which it was growing before, when it was a smaller market. But this means it's going to be a little harder to argue for some of those digital budgets as compared to what it was in the past, when you could always make the argument that you were growing so much faster than physical retail was. So a way to kind of think about this is we went from this period of kind of hilly growth, a lot of big ups and then downs a little bit, but still quite high, to what we jokingly referred to as shark fin-like growth, the year 2019, 2020, and then it came back down again in 2021. Now we've got more sort of rolling meadows, so kind of steady at this point, not the big hills that we saw before, but solid growth. So given that we're getting to this maturing level, where are some of the opportunities here? So I'm going to talk about three different ones. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about social in Mexico. And it's fascinating because Mexico is quite different than some of the other countries in the region for one key reason, which I'm going to talk about. First of all, if you look at the time spent on social in Mexico, It is very high compared to the global average. I think most folks know that. Latin America overall tends to over-index on how much time people are spending on social platforms. But what's also interesting is a lot of the fast-growing markets are also here. So the Philippines happens to be the fastest-growing e-commerce market in the world. But you're starting out with over 3 hours a day, on average, spent on social. Now, this can be multitasking, right? You may be watching TV. I think many of us watch Netflix while also having our phones with us. But it's a good chunk of the day being spent on social. In the US, we're just over 2 hours, so a pretty significant difference. Now, here's the big difference in Mexico as compared to other countries across the region. Mexico is still very dependent on Facebook compared to other parts of Latin America, which have shifted over to Instagram. Now, this was in a study we did that asked specifically about the platforms that were most useful when researching different brands and products. But you'll see also, if you look at the right-hand side, that Facebook is the black bar there. You also have very high adoption of YouTube as well as TikTok in Mexico. So this presents an interesting kind of landscape when you think about working together with content creators. And I'll talk about those a little bit later. But Facebook is typically not a creator and influencer-centric platform. The big three are Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. So we've started to see some really innovative things, particularly in relation to shopping on social platforms. And I think you're going to see a big opportunity here in that area. So a little more data to back this up. To kind of walk you through this, the x-axis on the bottom is the social percent of all online time. So the percentage of all the time that you are on the internet that is spent on social platforms is quite high in Mexico. You also see a relatively high level of social buyers as a percentage of digital buyers. So that means that you have started a purchase on social that you have ultimately ended up transacting with. So big opportunity here when it comes to using social platforms to drive purchases. Now, why do we think that social commerce overall has great potential? There have been a lot of different social commerce attempts over the years. Most of them have failed. I can't tell you how many articles there are saying that social commerce will never resemble what it is in China or what it is in Asia. And that's probably true, but I think it still is going to take a big chunk of e-commerce in North America, in Latin America more broadly, in other parts of the world, less so in Europe. But I think that to date, we've seen these two very separate things. We've got kind of inspiration on one side. We get inspired for our purchases from influencers or friends and family or from the media. And then we have this whole separate experience where you transact. And if you're lucky, when you click through on an ad, it might be the product that you saw. It might be a general page that you get sent to. Certainly doesn't know your size or the color you might be looking for. So I think inevitably, the two of these things are going to come together. And you've started seeing that with TikTok Shop having launched in Mexico quite recently. And I saw they're one of the sponsors of the event here today. But there will be a lot of focus on the shop options, particularly outside of the US, given all the different things that we have going on that make it not as great of a market for them as some other ones might be. Like I was in Saudi Arabia a couple of months ago, and there's a huge interest in that region, in Saudi and the UAE and other markets there, by some of these cross-border players that are looking to expand in the markets that they have some foothold in with the the overall TikTok offering. And in the US, you've started to see players having success with this as one of the the first social commerce offerings that's resonated. So Nike is making between 100 and 200 million on TikTok Shop right now. So is Victoria's Secret. So are other brands. Someone like a Lululemon now sells through them. I think they made like 60 million or so. So it's getting to be a significant platform. Again, Nike's revenues are over 50 billion, right? So it's a very small component, but still, I think we are going to get to this place. So be aware of different social commerce offerings, and don't believe that just because it hasn't taken off, it won't in the future. Second, retail media. It presents a lot of opportunities here, but with a very big caveat. So one of the ways that retail media is different here as compared to in other places is that you have this convergence of retail with other areas. So you have some companies that are combining retail and travel. The big one here is really retail together with financial services. We don't have this to the same degree in the US. Most of our big retailers don't necessarily have a fintech offering the way that some of the retailers here do. So an opportunity there. And then we've got others that are bringing them all together. So what this means is that you've got an incredible amount of data. You're not just talking about the retailer's shopping data. You're able to bring together transactional data that you might have through some of these fintech offerings, able to bring in data from the travel offerings. So really fantastic kind of groundwork for being able to target consumers very effectively here. So what does a typical kind of retail media market look like? The US at this point is relatively mature, I would say, in terms of retail media. It's still growing, but we have a ton of players that have been in this market for a while at this point. We also have a very dominant player. So Amazon takes in about 3/4 of all retail media ad dollars in the US. That's quite different than e-commerce, where it's only about 40% of the market. So it's much more dominant in this space. Walmart at number 2, around 8%, which means you've got all these other players vying for that remaining 16% of the market. Now, the other challenge is that advertisers, on average, work with only 3 to 5 different retail media networks. So they're not putting their spending across all of these at this point, hundreds of players in the market, particularly the smaller brands. Smaller brands just spend on the big players. So we're starting out from a place where it's a relatively concentrated spend, and at the same time, the brands, because they've been doing this for a while, are a little more sophisticated than the retailers are in terms of what they're looking for. So you're having to play catch up because consumers have been buying, have seen sponsored ads for years at this point. We looked at, there's a study that looked at the percentage of, for example, pages on Amazon or Walmart that had a sponsored product of some sort on them. It was 99% at this point. So you're sort of playing catch up if you're new in the retail media space. So what's this look like in Latin America? Like this. Mercado Libre has also a dominant share, but less dominant than Amazon does in the US. If you recall, Amazon was over 75%, Mercado Libre at about 55%. By the way, we do a lot of market share stuff at eMarketer, so you'll see a number of these. Amazon takes in about 17%, so Amazon is a stronger number 2 than Walmart is in the US in terms of that percentage. But you have a bigger percent that's up for grabs in Latin America as compared to what you saw in the US. If you recall, that red slice here was 16% in the US. But you also have lots of different players getting into the market, and they've been getting into it quite recently. This is the number of new retail media networks that were launched or that were rebranded by year in Latin America. So this is quite a recent phenomenon. And this is where you're going to be facing challenges, because to scale a retail media network costs a lot of money. There are a lot of fixed costs associated with it, even if you're starting a smaller one. Oftentimes, retailers do not have the talent on their teams. Building an ad platform is very different than running an e-commerce operation or a broader retail operation. A lot of these companies are trying to hire from social platforms, people who have other media platforms, people who have built an ad business. What's a typical approach? Oftentimes they'll take their marketing people and put them in to build an ad platform, but being a B2C marketer is very different than building an ad platform, a different set of skills. So this is going to be a challenge, again, to meet brands' expectations, given that, again, they're likely going to have partnered with a Mercado Libre or an Amazon, and they may not be looking to expand to a lot more players. So the bar is high. When you think about the fact that the overall market is growing, we saw e-commerce growing, but growth rates are coming down. Same thing with retail media. I'll show a slide in a minute around growth rates. They're starting to come down a bit. And it's almost like, if you know that concept of kinetic energy or Boyle's law in physics, the less space you have, the faster the balls move around within it. We're getting to a stage when you're going to have to be able to move really quickly because the overall pie is growing bit by bit, not as quickly as it was before, but you've got more players coming into it. So be aware that you're going to have to be nimble if you're one of these retailers launching in network today. So one thing to keep in mind that's good news for the retailers here is that they get the highest percentage of all of these different potential media platforms in Mexico. So the way to look at this is, of all the consumers who are online, how many of them visit a retail site of any type, a financial services site, or a travel site? And the red at the top is retail. So in Mexico, that's by far the biggest group. And if you're wondering, well, what else do people do online? They are going to social platforms or to read the news. So there's a lot of activity that isn't one of these three transactional ones. But essentially, if you're in retail, you're going to be in a better position than if you're a travel company here or if you're financial services of any kind. So where are the opportunities? This is the last slide on retail media. For many of you, it will be in partnerships and in off-site media. So what does that mean? So this is what we see in the US right now. This is the increase year on year, the percentage change in ad spend on off-site, which is the top, versus on-site, which is the bottom. So as I said, the overall market is growing, but off-site, that is using the data that you collect on consumers to target them elsewhere, is going to be where a lot of the growth is. Because it's going to be hard to get the scale you need as one of the new retail media networks in the market today. Again, there are just so many of them right now, and you can consider partnerships in many different areas. If you sell consumer electronics, you can partner with a retailer in the apparel space. You can partner with companies completely outside of retail. When I was in the Uber riding to the airport in New York, I was given an ad that was for use LinkedIn ads to target people on CTV using the tactics you might use on Uber to target another rider in the cab with you. So it's a combination of different players, so don't go it alone. Start very early with partnerships if you're thinking of going this direction. All right, our third one, video, but not the linear TV kind, is paving the path forward. So what does that mean? Well, the rise of streaming and some of the digital-first ad strategies means that legacy media companies are no longer taking in the same percentage of ad revenues that they did just a few years ago. And this is from a report we did in 2023. We have updated figures as well, but you've seen the percentage of these big companies in Mexico, looking at Televisa, decline, right? Not that brands aren't spending with them, but now brands are spending, the biggest bucket digitally is display, second biggest is search. So you've started seeing some of this shift away. And if as brands, if you're still spending heavily on linear TV, know that many others are starting to pivot toward digital channels. And video in Mexico in particular is a critical key part of advertisers' strategies. So this is video as a percent of total digital ad spend in different countries. Both, the Latin American ones are in red here, other countries are in gray. Video's huge here. You've already seen this shift, and by video, this could be advertising on Netflix, it could be advertising on YouTube. There are a lot of different ways that you can leverage video. But I would say if you're not doing this, realize that many others are. And a lot of the platforms are prioritizing video these days. If any of you spend much time on LinkedIn, their algorithms are definitely prioritizing video at this point. They like the short videos. I can't remember the exact figure, but people tend to watch something like 4 seconds of video before they move on. So certainly get to be an expert in short-form video. There's this whole trend even coming from China, the short dramas that are emerging there, these 60-second dramas. So if you don't have people on your team that really understand this or can help you with it, might be a good idea to expand to include them. And Mexico is actually going to be the first country in the region where spending on digital video is going to surpass linear TV. And that's happening this year. And this is, again, I mentioned, different than what we've seen in the US, where this happened quite a while ago. Linear TV spending is getting smaller and smaller in the US every year, whereas it's on par here. It's almost like a 3-to-1 ratio in the States in terms of spending on digital video versus on TV. But we're getting there. Again, Mexico is kind of the leader in the region when it comes to these video offerings. So the opportunity, definitely be leaning into content creators, which is the term that influencers generally prefer to use, and that you hear about in the creator economy. And why is that? It's because that is what will drive interest in your brand and transactions. So in speaking relatively recently with the CMO of a big consumer electronics brand in the US, he was saying that they can invest millions in the most beautiful creative. They can create these phenomenal videos about their product that might be emotional and incredibly well shot, but they can't move the needle with them. That owned creative doesn't have the same impact as someone else creating content who is a professional content creator that talks about your brand. And you've got a very templated approach right now. You'll get details from the brand as a creator around what they want you to do. It's usually a negotiation back and forth with the creator pushing their own approach and the brand saying what they want to achieve. But this whole creator economy is growing incredibly quickly. And it's not just the influencers or the creators with hundreds of millions of followers. This is, a lot of the brands have moved away from the mega influencers, the Kardashians of the world, to the nano and the micro influencers, to working with a larger number of them that can tell that brand story. I was on a panel at Google a couple weeks ago when I was there with a content creator, and she was talking about the back and forth that she has with brands and some of the challenges and what it takes to break in. But every content creator at this point will be looking for brands that are interested in working together with them. And there are many agencies out there that will help you find the right people to represent your brand as well. But this is a key area to be considering as you think about the strategy for growing going forward. Don't just go that owned direction with your media. And so to summarize, I've talked about a few different things here. First of all, Mexico's growth trajectory. It's been phenomenal, but growth is going to be a little bit more tempered going forward. So again, that idea that we're just going to get a bigger and bigger pie every year is marginally true, but it's not going to increase substantially year on year. And again, that's the same thing you're seeing everywhere. There are very few markets that are in their big growth potential right now. There's some very early stage ones, but pretty much everywhere is maturing. And you're seeing the same thing in terms of time spent, right? We had those really high numbers, over 3 hours a day here on social. That's not increasing a whole lot anywhere in the world. In fact, we're sort of reaching peak time spent on digital right now. So again, that's going to raise the bar on what you need to do to be able to continue to attract consumers to your sites or to your e-commerce offerings. And the country over-indexes on time spent on social with a heavy focus on Facebook. But now's the time to start thinking about content creators. If you have been heavily focused on targeting on Meta, on Facebook in particular, you may not have the experience with content creators that you're going to need to develop. And if you remember that slide that I talked about with TikTok and YouTube also being huge in Mexico, it's a good time to start experimenting with those. In fact, we have a slide that looks at how much time consumers spend with different social platforms, and then how much ad spending goes to them. And it's quite fascinating, because if you look at Meta across the board, a huge chunk of ad spending goes to Meta. And consumers aren't spending the same percentage of their time on that platform that advertisers are spending of their budget. Now, there are many reasons for that, right? Meta is phenomenal at targeting. They've done a very good job. I was speaking with someone yesterday here who was talking about they've kind of funneled most of their money that direction because they are so good at it, and said the other platforms just are nowhere near where they are in terms of their sophistication to be able to target specific groups of consumers. But again, think about what some of these other platforms may promise, because a platform like YouTube, for example, very much under-indexes on spending versus the amount of time that consumers, ad spending versus the amount of time that consumers are spending on the platform. Same thing Netflix, right? I don't know if Netflix does advertising here, but consumers spend a lot of time on the platform, and having launched the ad-supported offering in the US not all that long ago, that's still very nascent, and so opportunities on CTV, even though there is still limited inventory and it is expensive. Retailers looking to launch retail media networks should be looking at partnerships. I mentioned them. Be very cautious about doing it on your own. You're going to need to reach millions of consumers with your multi-brand retail offering to be able to scale the network effectively. But there are many ways to increase that. And again, sort of going back to the Middle East, they're going through the same thing right now. So the UAE is another market that surged recently, and they also are seeing really high e-commerce penetration rates right now. But it's very hard to build a retail media offering in a market that small. So obviously, Mexico, with a population of 130 million, is very different than a UAE is. But still, it'll be challenging to do it alone. So start thinking about who you might work together with. And another thing to keep in mind is you probably don't want to do everything in-house. So in the States, there are players that you can outsource your ad sales teams to. That will work together with you to build your ad platform. Definitely consider some of these other options, because it's a lot to hire an entire team around a retail media network, and it's tempting because the margins are so great, particularly in comparison to what you see in e-commerce, but it's a tall hill to climb. And then ensure your content and advertising strategy includes a strong focus on video. We talked a lot about that before, but if you're focused on display and on image-based advertising, you need to be adding video to your creative. And you're going to need to test it out yourself. I said you work with content creators. Of course, you want some of your own video to supplement that as well. Again, testing out different ways of reaching consumers, different length videos, different topics. You want to be throwing all kinds of stuff out there. We, for example, are in the midst of figuring out our social video strategy, and we had effectively like an internal contest where we had everyone submit their approaches to social video, saying, here are some ideas, but come to us with your own. And we had everyone from our sales team to our tech team to the analysts talking, creating these videos around how we could highlight what we're doing, and we're selecting the best of those and creating a strategy around it. So as we look forward, there's a lot that can happen in a decade. We saw Mexico go from that 2% to almost 20% of all sales happening online. And we may find ourselves back here in 10 years' time, looking back at where we were today and having a hard time believing that we ever were at that stage. So as we think of the cultural references back to 2025, we may be talking about, do we remember when season 3 of The White Lotus came out, the one in Thailand, or when everyone was talking about agentic AI and how it was going to transform the world? By 2035, it may have, it may not have. We're going to have to see. And then finally, well, we as women don't have the man bun. We may look back on 2025 and laugh because women around the world were spending hours getting their hair to look just like this. So with that, it's up to all of us to shape the future. All of you are playing a really important role in doing that. I would love to talk with any of you who might be around. I'm here today. If you would like a copy of the presentation, please grab the QR code that's up here right now. And again, appreciate your taking the time to be here today. Thank you.